So our next speaker is Senator Mark Warner from the Commonwealth of Virginia. Senator Warner was elected to the U.S. Senate on November 8th and re-elected in November 2014. He serves in the Senate Finance, Banking, Budget, and Intelligence Committee. During his time in the Senate, Senator Warner has established himself as a bipartisan leader who has worked with Republicans, Democrats alike to cut the red tape, increase government performance, accountability, and this is real interesting, to promote private sector innovation and job creation. He is recognized as a national leader representing military men, women, and veterans, and works to find bipartisan balanced solutions to address the country's debt and deficit. From 2002 to 2006, he served as the governor of Virginia. When he first left office in 2006, Virginia was ranked as the best state for business, best managed state, and the best state in which to receive a public education. He's the first of his family to graduate from college. He has spent 20 years as a successful technology and business leader in Virginia before entering public office. He's an early investor in cellular technology. He co-founded a company that became Nextel and invested in hundreds of startup technology companies that created tens of thousands of jobs. So what he is doing with Virginia and cyber and education, private sector, he is a model for what other states should be striving for. But now a couple interesting facts about him. Okay. Number one, he's the kind of friend we all want to have. You want a good doctor to be a friend. You want a good mechanic to be a friend. You want a member of the clergy to be your friend. You want a good cyber guy to be your friend. But the best friend to have is a beer maker and a winemaker. The senator's a winemaker. So we hope to really improve our relationship as we go forward into this evening. But that's not it. That's part of the facts. When I mention the cellular industry, we're talking the time when the cell phones were bricks. Who remembers those? Unfortunately, a lot of us do. But this is his own admission, and this is probably true for a lot of us. The buttons on the phones today, he said, I don't know what half of them do anymore. So with that, Senator Warner.
How do you make a small fortune in the wine business? You start with a large fortune. And it's a great honor for me to be here this morning to get a chance to address all of you who are doing so much for our country. I want to echo Sean's comments about how important it is that we get this right. As the Colonel mentioned, around Capitol Hill, I am known as the tech guy. I spent a career in technology before I came into politics. And I used to be on the Commerce Committee. I would ask questions and say, gosh, Warner, you really get it. The truth is, my technology knowledge, I was very current circa 2000. The unfortunate thing is that still puts me about a generation ahead of most of my colleagues. So this is an area in terms of cyber where there's a lot that I and all my colleagues, and for that matter, most all Americans have got an enormous amount to learn. And these kind of settings where we bring industry, our colleagues in the military, academia, all together kind of to cross-pollinate is terribly important. Because the truth is, as we think, whether it's from our cell phones to our devices, technology obviously makes us all more interconnected. It eases our way of life. It makes us kind of live in a more productive way. But as you know, more than most, it also creates a whole new set of vulnerabilities. And the truth is, and I will even acknowledge on the front end myself, that the ability for all of us outside the direct cyber field to have good personal cyber hygiene, we've got a long way to go. Matter of fact, as someone who tries to stay abreast and co-chair the Cyber Caucus, one of the things I would hope that would come out of these kind of settings would be a clear, concise how-to on personal cyber hygiene. Because the notion is, even if you don't do your own good cyber hygiene, the fact is all of our networks are interconnected. So my failure to take appropriate actions on my devices may end up having a bad effect on your devices and your networks as well. And if we think this is a challenge today, only imagine as we move into the so-called Internet of Things. We now have about 10 billion devices. By 2020, estimates are with the Internet of Things, 34 billion devices. Some in this room may know, but I know a lot of my colleagues on the Hill were more than a little bit concerned when we identified a problem, even already amongst toys. I think about, I've got 3 daughters. They're all a little older now, in the 20s, but the notional idea that the dolls that kids play with right now have this kind of interactive devices in it. And I saw the Hong Kong company that had about 9 million toys hacked into. Well, children's personal information was stolen. So the notion of the need for us to get cyber right only exponentially increases. And the truth is, as we all know, as we heard from Sean, I'm sure it will be the theme throughout the day, cyber is such an asymmetrical threat, and the cost both of preventing and the cost of actually being able to intrude is so low that we really need to have not simply a whole of government approach, but we truly need a whole of society approach. Now, while I commend the Obama administration in terms of their kind of cyber hygiene effort in this last year that Tom Donilon is heading up, we still have an enormous way to go. When we think about our colleagues in the military, America's military is absolutely the best, second to none. We know that. The one part of where I work that is still relatively well-functioning, I use that on a relative basis, and I, for one, I hope this would be the one area that, regardless of where we fall in the political agreement, we could all agree, thank God we're only 18 days away from the end of this election. But the one area where Congress still functions on a relatively decent basis is around funding our military and homeland security. We spend about $650 billion a year, DOD and DHS. Our defenses are extraordinarily strong. The one area, as again, you all know, Colonel knows as well, that where we have the ability to be penetrated by bad actors, non-state actors, and for that matter, state actors in such an asymmetrical way is the realm of cyber. And again, an area why we've got to do so much more and try to make sure, as Sean said, that we get this right. We don't have the option of failure. I absolutely agree with Cyber Command. The notion of a catastrophic cyber attack, so-called cyber Pearl Harbor against the United States, it may not be as devastating as the original Pearl Harbor, but a major cyber attack. The question is not if, it is only a question of when. And how we make sure that you all, as the cyber experts in the field, me and my colleagues as policymakers, kind of in a sense, get Americans ready for that eventuality is extraordinarily important. Now, where I sit, we've got a long way to go. Cyber, because it touches so many different aspects of our life, is very hard to wrestle with from a policy standpoint. One of the things that, as somebody who spent longer in the private sector than I have in the public sector, I went from being a tech guy, a CEO, a venture capitalist, then I became a governor. And I always wondered why the federal government in so many ways was so dysfunctional. One of the reasons why it is so dysfunctional, candidly, is congressional oversight was divided up into these committee jurisdictions basically 70 or 80 years ago. And you talk about Democrats and Republicans fighting each other, that's nothing compared to committees fighting each other over congressional jurisdiction. And in cyber, where we cross across so many domains, this is played out in spades. In the last year alone, 9 separate congressional committees held more than 20 hearings on cyber-related issues, from cyber insurance to cyber threats to cyber security to cyber products. And the outgrowth of all that activity, matter of fact, the outgrowth of all that activity since the year 2000, the Congress of the United States has only passed one significant piece of legislation regarding cyber. And that was a relatively watered down, while important first step, voluntary information sharing bill. Now, with the nature of this threat exponentially increasing on a daily, weekly, and monthly basis, that is not acceptable. One of the reasons why, along with Cory Gardner, the Republican senator from Colorado, we have tried to put together a cyber caucus that will, at least on the Senate side, look across the committee jurisdiction lines to try to make sure that we can look at this issue around cyber on a more holistic fashion. And let me acknowledge with that disclosure on the front end that while compared to some of my colleagues, my technology knowledge is still high, I've got an enormous amount to learn. So I am very much open for business. Rosie Heiss, where's Rosie, who is here? Right back here. Please see Rosie as well if you've got suggestions and criticisms of my comments, because we have enormous amount to learn. One area that I want to touch on before I get into the kind of bulk of my comments is something that has emerged over the last year and a half plus of why I think it is terribly important that you engage with us in Congress on trying to get this right. And that was the question around encryption. We all saw the press and the kind of hubbub that arose around the Apple FBI concerns around encryption. Enormous challenges on both sides. I sit on the Intel committee. I understand the threat posed by bad individuals in terms of threatening our homeland and the need for the Intel community, and for that matter, law enforcement, to have ways to track the bad guys. But I also know that if we simply create a government-mandated backdoor, at least my view in the short term is all that will do is push the bad actors onto foreign-based hardware and software. There are close to 2,000 new apps added every day to the iPhone store. Virtually 78% of them are encrypted. Almost half of them are now foreign-based. I agree with all our colleagues from NSA that encryption makes us stronger. So I reached out to Mike McCall, the chairman of the Homeland Security Committee in the House, Republican chair of the Homeland Security Committee, and said, this is one of those areas where we actually do need, as policymakers, to step back and put folks like you, experts in a room on a commission. Now, traditionally, when Congress talks about a commission, that is political speak for a punt. In this case, a short-term punt actually is the right answer. To get cyber experts, computer experts, privacy experts, civil liberty experts in the right room to get together to find that common area where we can, particularly on the national security side, and I think we are fairly well positioned there, to make sure that we get this right, so that in the aftermath of God forbid, another terrorist activity or homegrown activity that would take place, that Congress doesn't overreact without the thoughtfulness that this issue requires. So encryption, while it is off the headlines right now, is one that will be coming back, and it might be a template on how we take on some of these issues. And again, my hope is that this bipartisan commission we could put forward, candidly, we've almost missed some of that opportunity because we've blown 9 months since the terrible shootings in California, to try to get the right folks in the room to think this through. I want to spend my balance of my time talking about 3 cyber breaches and some of the ramifications of each of those cyber breaches, at least in terms of how I'm trying to think through some of these issues. The first is the Yahoo breach, and the theme around that is the cost of breach. I, for one, was flabbergasted as a former tech guy when I heard that Yahoo had been breached, 500 million user breaches had taken place, and Yahoo had had this information potentially for months and failed to disclose. And that we've already seen some of this information being put up on some of the dark net in terms of sale of this data. To me, if a 500 million user breach is not a material piece of information that needs to be disclosed, then what is? And personally, I contacted the chair of the SEC and am extraordinarily disappointed as the ranking member on the Oversight Committee of the SEC. They are going to hear much more from me on this, that they have not put in place standards in terms of what materiality is along data breach. And the truth is, it's candidly not just Yahoo. I think we all know that virtually every major company, and for that minor company, is assaulted on a cyber attack basis virtually every day. Yet out of over 9,000 public companies in America, since the year 2000, there have only been 100 companies that have reported some level or another of data breach. We think about Yahoo, we think about Target, we think about JP Morgan, the list goes on and on and on. Part of this, and one of the areas that I've been working on, is trying to put in place a comprehensive, bipartisan federal data breach standard law. Right now, we have 48 separate state laws, and only 12 states have even some minimum level of disclosure in terms of data breach. That's crazy. We've got to make sure, now again, I know for a long time, industry's view was, you got a data breach, let's just sweep it under the rug because it's better to eat those costs than to have them into the marketplace, but that is not an acceptable process going forward. Our information sharing legislation is a step forward. I think the jury is still out on whether it is sufficient. But we are actively working. I think there may even be some point in the lame duck, and if not in the lame duck, in the beginnings of next year, to have comprehensive bipartisan data breach legislation in place that will set a national federal standard. And the challenge right now, we could have it right now today, but what we've got is, and sometimes it's my old industry, telecom, you've got industry by industry saying, yes, data breach standards make sense, but don't touch our industry, we need a carve-out. If we're going to do this in a comprehensive way, we need to make sure all industries are in, no carve-outs. Yes, there ought to be safe harbor if you come forward with this information, but if we're going to make sure that we get this right, we've got to have standards around data breach. Now, the truth is as well around costs. We talk about some of the cost in terms of public sector trust, but I, again, absolutely agree with the DNI that the costs of cyber intrusions, which now have been estimated at about $400 billion a year in intellectual property loss. Think about that just from a business and, from that matter, a national security issue. If we have $400 billion of our IP being stolen on a relative annual basis, and some of this I hear about in the intel community that chills me to the bone, that means those are billions of dollars that our adversaries don't need to spend on basic R&D because it's just a lot easier to breach our systems and rip off our intellectual property. So the very real costs of cyber breaches and data breaches has to be an issue that we address. Second breach that I want to talk about was the OPM breach, which speaks to the question around innovation and modernization. Now, I love being the senator from Virginia. We are blessed with a lot of folks in the military. We are blessed with virtually all of the intel agencies except for those one folks over in Maryland who shall not be named. And I am blessed with a whole lot of federal employees, current and former. I got to tell you, with OPM, there is not a week that goes by, even now, a year plus later, that I don't hear from a current or former federal employee saying, I was part of that 14 million plus who had my personal information hacked into. And it brings about the question of how do we make sure from the whole of government standpoint that we get this right. Clearly in the case of OPM, there were sloppy procedures. Clearly from the state of OPM, and for that matter, everything on the .gov side of the House, there was not the same kind of ability for DHS to put standards in place that were actually followed as NSA has been able to put in place on the .mil side of the House. So it astonished me as we dug into this that you found major federal agencies that got recommendations from DHS that legal counsels and various .gov agencies said, well, that's a recommendation, we can just ignore it. Now the good news is we did change that. If DHS is going to be the cop on the beat in terms of security on the .gov side of the House, they've got to have the ability to implement their procedures. But it also raises bigger questions about how we buy and modernize our IT systems. One of the things that I know this kind of gets a little in the weeds, but I think it's a terribly important change. We got into the NDAA, the Defense Authorization Bill recently, is a change in the procurement rules that say we can move away from least cost possible price, which often means, particularly in technology, you've got to go to the cheapest product, which oftentimes may not be the most innovative or the most sufficient. So get rid of the least cost possible to be able to move to more value purchasing is something that is terribly important. At the same time, we've got to recognize that we've got to do a better job of innovation. You know, the federal government spends about $88 billion a year on IT. The amazing thing is 75% of that IT budget is basically spent on operations and maintenance. So again, I may be a little bit rusty on my technology. The one thing I absolutely know is if you take an old legacy system and instead of ever getting rid of it and simply cobble together patch on top of patch on top of patch on top of patch, every time you add a patch, you add a new potential cyber vulnerability. So when we factor through the costs of how we keep our IT systems current, I think the cyber costs that have to be built in to those budgets. It's why I'm one of the original co-sponsors of the so-called Move It Act, which would move up and increase the move towards new, fresher, and more innovative systems in terms of IT. The truth of the matter is, I think we need a thorough review, and President Obama has talked about this in terms of proposed budgets. Oftentimes, Congress has kind of always kicks the can on anything infrastructure-wise, traditional infrastructure, for that matter, in terms of IT infrastructure. We kick the can and do an additional patch as opposed to bite the bullet and do a capital budget, which any rational business would have, and say, let's go ahead and get rid of some of these legacy systems and put a whole brand new system in place. And that's where we need to move if we're going to make sure that we're going to be truly serious about cyber in terms of innovation. How we purchase, in terms of not simply least cost, how we think about, particularly within cyber, the need to constantly upgrade on a real-time basis. When you have to set out a set of procurement requirements and go through this lengthy procurement process in the world of cyber, even if your procurement idea was good, by the time you purchase the item 6, 9, 12 months later, chances are the whole plane has moved and the playing field has moved. So again, we need your help and thoughts on how we can make this, in a sense, real time in terms of our purchasing process and upgrade process in the federal government. And while I commend Secretary Carter and others for thinking about how we can do innovation, let me quickly remind all of you guys, Silicon Valley's got some innovation, but I will match, particularly in the cyber field, what's going on in Northern Virginia with anything that's going on in Silicon Valley. And would strongly encourage those of you who may come from the left coast to take a look at some of the activities we have here in Northern Virginia. One of our state-sponsored efforts was at so-called Center for Innovative Technology. We've got a cyber incubator called Mach 37, 35 cyber companies incubated out of that enterprise just in the last 2 years, a number of them on second and third round funding. We've got to make sure that we, around this question of innovation and modernization, we both procure differently, we upgrade differently, and we look for innovation in every way we can. Third area I want to talk about is cyber physical attacks and what we do with those. Now, I have been a huge advocate in Virginia, and for that matter, nationwide, for autonomous vehicles. Drones, use of automated cars or driverless cars. I often like to use the analogy, I know a lot of folks feel that around driverless cars, that it's still 25, 30 years away. I will only commend to you that I did pretty well in the cell phone business, because when I got in 1982 and through those early years in the 80s, all of the smart guys on Wall Street and all of the smart folks in the telco industry, they had a single prediction. It'll take 30 years to build out a single wireless network in America, and at the end of that 30 years, Colonel, people said 5% of Americans will have cell phones. They were wrong, I got rich. So for folks who say, drones, delivery of drones, Google Wing has been delivering burritos in Blacksburg at Virginia Tech today. For those of you that driverless cars are 30 years away, I point to the cell phone example. Enormous changes in productivity, enormous job challenge changes will come out of that as well, but think about the potential in terms of physical threat that would be posed by hacking into those autonomous vehicles. We've already seen in 2015 the effort that disabled a Jeep. We've seen Johns Hopkins already prove out their ability to disable and take control of drones. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to move away or walk away from autonomous vehicles. It does mean that the notion of physical threats beyond intellectual property and innovation and personal information threats, there are physical threats that are involved in the cyber world as well. And we have to think through this. We've seen as well already that take place in real time in Ukraine back in 2015 when actors, probably Russian actors, took over for a few hours a Ukrainian utility system and literally cut off power to over 100,000 folks. More recently, we've seen even here in New York, in the public domain, Iranian forces take over a dam in New York. Thank God nothing happened with that. But there was an ability to penetrate one of our physical infrastructure systems. So this raises a whole host of questions. One of the most important is going to be attribution. How do we make sure that we've got the forensic and cyber abilities to be able to trace back the source of these actors? And then when we see agents like Russian agents using the so-called cipher caliphate, the ability for actors, state actors and non-state actors to use deception practices around attribution makes this enormously challenging. How do we get this right? How much attribution is enough? Obviously, for one of the presidential candidates, the fact that you have uniform agreement from 17 intelligence agencies about potential interference in our political system, that uniform 17 unanimous agreement that there is interference going on in our political system, that attribution is not enough for him. Well, Sean made that comment earlier, but I found that astounding. This is not a political commentary as much as the fact that how we figure out what is the right standard for attribution, what is the right percentage, chances are we're not going to ever get, or it's going to be rare that we're going to get to that 100% absolute surety. From a legal, from an ethical, from a policy standpoint, you need to help us, particularly as we get this into the outside the DoD realm, into the congressional realm, you need to help us figure this out so that we as policymakers will have some guidepost on what amount of attribution is enough. And this is a field that I think is extraordinarily new. It is one that, from a policymaking standpoint, I've thought about a lot of these areas. It's not one that I have, I I don't feel that I'm at all competent to kind of make that judgment at this point. You need to help me and help my colleagues figure that out. Because once we get to that question about attribution, the question then becomes response. Now, there is an immediate sense that we need to respond in kind, tit for tat, within the cyber domain. And many times that may be the best possibility. But I think we have to keep basically available all options, including military force, in terms of ability to react to cyber attacks and cyber incursions. We have seen some effectiveness around the name and shame, particularly in terms of governmental activities, taking on the 5 Chinese hackers, and then more recently the naming of the 7 Iranian hackers. But name and shame may not always work. So one of the things you need to give policymakers are, what is that continuum of response that, again, this would fall more often into the realm of the military or the executive branch, but at some level or another, Congress will stick our nose in this. You need to give us some sense around what is the level of attribution we need to make a response, what should be those type of responses, how proportional does it need to be within the cyber domain, do we simply do name and shame, what are other aspects? We've obviously seen economic sanctions imposed on Russia, at least indirectly, but we need a clear indication of what those menu of options would be. And then finally, where do we go from here? Let me do a little more as a Virginia guy, bragging on what we're doing in the Commonwealth, and then when we see all this challenge also as an economic development guy, an opportunity. I'm proud of the fact, for those of you who are potential cyber companies or cyber entities or looking to locate, Virginia is the first state in the country to make computer science part of our core curriculum. Starting in 2018, all schools will have computer science. My hope is that every high school and virtually most of the middle schools will actually be teaching computer coding. Right now, we have engaged a number of our universities, as well as even some of our high schools, in trying to do a statewide cyber challenge that we hope to play out in early in 2017 down at VMI, and would again welcome companies or entities to help be judges or participate. We are putting in place a robust pipeline. We now have I think 11 of our colleges and community colleges certified. My goal, working with the governors, to have every community college and every 4-year institution in Virginia cyber certified in terms of our training. Because as I travel the Commonwealth and talk to folks, I mean, for better or for worse, this is a growth field. It's not going away. There is no silver bullet that is going to make us forever safe in the cyber domain. You know the numbers as well as I do. 200,000 unfilled cyber jobs in America today, 17,000 of them in Virginia. Average starting salary about $88,000. That is an extraordinarily attractive opportunity for a lot of people. And not everybody needs to be in Washington, or for that matter, Northern Virginia, to do this. One of the things we're putting together as well is kind of a Cyber 101 roadshow that we can go around to local, smaller, rural chambers of commerce, just to make sure that those small enterprises can kind of ask Cyber 101 questions, acknowledge what they don't know, so they can be prepared. And as those kind of vulnerabilities get exposed, that presents economic opportunities and job opportunities as well. So this is, I think, the challenge of our age. I would echo, I'm sure, what is will be the theme of all the speakers. This is not something that we can get wrong. This is something that, while we've seen Americans' reaction to kind of physical terrorist threats when somebody flies an airplane or takes out a firearm, but if we see physical or other destruction coming around in the aftermath of a cyber incident, you will see the American public rightfully say, all right, Congress, President, what are you going to do? And as we've seen so many times, sometimes when we rush to make policy in the aftermath of tragedies, not always very good policy comes out. So work with us with this cyber caucus so that we can try to make some sense of the mismatch around congressional jurisdictions, and we can help educate my colleagues to get all to kind of cyber 101, number one. Number two, help us with cyber hygiene. I still, as somebody, again, relatively well informed in this field, at least compared to my colleagues, I don't have a 5-point cyber hygiene plan that I ought to make in every speech I make to every group I talk to across Virginia. Make it easy, make it simple, make it understandable, and kind of even how-to with two-factor identification and authorization, but we need that kind of basic component. Number three, help put the pressure on us, I believe, at least on encryption, and I again understand that commissions are often punts. This is one where we need to get the right people in the room. Let's get encryption sorted through in a way that meets the needs of law enforcement and national security, but also continues to make us safe and doesn't simply push all of the American business and make American business competitively disadvantaged against foreign-based hardware and software. Help us as well as we move through the procurement process, and for those of you on the governmental side, please, please, please make the case within your entity. Don't simply do a patch, and Lord knows it's harder to get IT engineers to agree than Democrats and Republicans to agree, but we got to go ahead and junk some of these legacy systems and put modern systems in place. Let's spend the capital budget, not continue to do the patches. And finally, let's acknowledge that this is a problem here to stay and work with all of us to make sure that we have the workforce in the pipeline, and part of that, and my job will be making sure, while we want to encourage particularly people on the federal side to stay on the federal side, if we're going to do that, we need to look differently at the compensation models. I'm working actually on a cyber reserve corps, so there would be a series of people with pre-clearance that in the event of a major cyber incident could come from the private sector and surge in to the public sector to help us in the event of a disaster. But one of the things I need help on as well is trying to make sure on clearances, because the truth is, as much as I'd love people to spend their whole career on the federal side and the governmental side of the house, most folks, considering the dollars made on the private sector side, and as somebody who's done pretty well on the private sector side, I'm not going to criticize that, we've got to have a much easier path in terms of clearances so that people can move from public to private and back to public in a way that is smoother. Now, that's a hard thing to do in terms of potential conflicts of interest, but we've got to sort this through because not all of the expertise is going to stay on one side of the house or the other. And then finally, this is, I'll end with where I started. One, I need your help. I got a whole lot to learn. I want to be the champion in this field. I think it is critically important. I was lucky enough to get in on the wireless industry beginnings. I think the cyber threat and the cyber economic opportunities is every bit much as big, if not bigger. We've got to get that right. And we've got to continue to make the case that this is not just a whole of government, but really is a whole of society. And it's each and every one of our responsibility to make sure that we keep our country, our community, and our families safe. Thank you all very much.